at your branch. And really, I wanted to start off by saying, you know, what a fast-moving situation it's been. You know, in a matter of days, we've seen, you know, the biggest demonstrations in years, and certainly the most diverse and young as well. But we've also seen the fall of two racist and colonialist statues as well. So Edward Colston in Bristol, and then Robert Mulligan in Tower Hamlets, which is East London. You know, the two of them both being slave traders, and both statues having been taken down a matter of days apart from one another, and big protests in Oxford as well, calling for the statue of Cecil Rose to fall too. And really, all of this has been sparked, of course, by the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis on Monday, the 25th of May. Police officer Derek Chauvin knelt on his neck for 9 minutes, with other officers standing around doing nothing to stop him, at times helping him to restrain Floyd. And all of this despite the presence of a watching crowd, and Floyd pleading with Chauvin and saying, "I can't breathe." You know, George Floyd was a 46-year-old father of a 6-year-old girl. His killer, David Chauvin, worked as a police officer for 19 years. And in that time, had multiple complaints around his excessive use of force, and so on, brought against him, but still maintained his job. And actually, Floyd and Chauvin had worked together as bouncers at a local nightclub as well. And so actually knew each other before this incident, even if it had been, you know, vaguely aware of one another or what have you. And the last thing really is how much the words of Floyd echoed really what Eric Garner had said in 2014 when he had been killed by the hands of the police, at the hands of the police. You know, "I can't breathe." And all of this really has sparked protests, first starting in Minneapolis itself, which included, you know, what I think is an act worth celebrating, burning down the police station where the 4 officers were actually based, who'd murdered George Floyd. But more than that, these protests that have begun, first starting in Minneapolis and really spreading quite quickly across the country, are very similar to the Black Lives Matter movement that had started years before, and in a lot of ways, well, in serious ways, has really ignited it, but has a lot of character of its own as well. And what's Trump's response to all of this? Well, he tweeted, "These thugs are dishonoring the memory of George Floyd, and I won't let it happen. Just spoke to Governor Tim Walz and told him that the military is with him all the way. Any difficulty and we will assume control, but when the looting starts, the shooting starts. Thank you." To me, I think the real insult to George Floyd's memory is the audacity that Donald Trump has in trying to take ownership of the narrative around his murder, while in the same breath quoting the racist Miami police chief in the late 1960s, Walter Hidley, who'd reveled in the use of brutal force in poor Black neighborhoods. And really, I think what all of this shows, I mean, Floyd's death highlights yet again the disproportionate deaths of Black people at the hands of the police, and more generally, the brutal treatment experienced by Black and BAME communities altogether. Now, around 1 in 1,000 Black men and boys can expect to die at the hands of the police in the United States. And they're also 2.5 times more likely to die in such an encounter than their white counterparts. But the brutal treatment of Black communities is nothing new. And instead, it's actually been a constant feature of US history. So think about first, you know, the violence of slavery, America's original sin, or the treatment of the civil rights movement protesters in the 1950s and 60s, things like tear gas and water cannons and hounds being used against often non-violent protesters, particularly at the very beginning. Or you go to a point a lot more recently to us in 1991 with the brutal beating of Rodney King, which sparked the LA riots the following summer after the officer responsible was acquitted of all charges. Really, I think the violence is not simply accidental or the result of a handful of bad cops. You know, the police are the front line of a state, that's established and dominated by a ruling class that relies upon the state's monopoly on the legal use of violence to discipline the masses and divide working class people of all backgrounds in order to preserve their own power and privilege. Now, here in Britain, we stand in solidarity because we're internationalists. You know, the people in the United States, both who are dying and also who are protesting, are our brothers and sisters. But more than that, we're also protesting because we see the disproportionate deaths of BAME people in police custody and at the hands of the police in this country as well. You know, think about David Oluwale, who was killed at the hands of the police in Leeds in 1969, Cynthia Jarrett in Tottenham in 1985, Joy Gardner in Crouch End in 1993, Christopher Alder in Hull in 1998, Sean Rigg in Brixton 2008, or Mott Duggan in Tottenham in 2011, just to name some. And more broadly, I think what we see is the disproportionate criminalisation of BAME people. You know, you think about the recent incident in Manchester in lockdown where Desmond Ziggy Mombayara was tasered unconscious by the police while he was with his young child. And all of this is filmed, you know, trying to calm down the situation, but was treated in this way because he was seen to be resisting arrest. And his child, you can hear in the video, his child just frightened and screaming. But to be honest, I mean, more generally, BAME lives are treated as cheap and expendable. You know, that's why I think you've seen during this pandemic, Black people and ethnic minorities disproportionately exposed, becoming critically ill and dying from COVID-19. I spilled some coffee. So what is to be done? Understandably, socialists defend the right of people to fight back by any means necessary. It's been quoted quite a lot recently, rightly so. But Martin Luther King said riots are the voice of the unheard. But riots can't solve the problem. And at best, what they do is provide temporary liberation and exhilaration before the state and the ruling class regroup and often take quite brutal revenge. But what about reform? I think as well as socialists, you know, of course, we support the fight for reforms as they can and do make differences and improvements in people's lives. But they're nowhere near enough, and a lot of the time can be rolled back. So you think about, for instance, in the United States itself, where the civil rights movement was a heroic struggle that led to not just civil rights, but voting rights legislation as well. In its aftermath, what you saw was a great focus on electing Black leaders, you know, getting Black faces in high places. And the culmination of this was the election of Barack Obama in 2008. But what did Obama's 8 years in office achieve? You know, in response to George Floyd's death, Obama said that institutional racism should not be normal in 2020 and has called on Americans to come together to heal the legacy of bigotry. But we've got to admit and recognize that actually Black Lives Matter was established under during Obama's presidency precisely because he failed to deliver on the hopes invested in him in the first place. And so actually, I was going to show a slide, but I forgot to. Oh, I can share the screen. Okay, I'll show a slide that. Yeah, no, I can't share a screen. Move on. But essentially, what the graph is showing is actually the number of police killings in the United States from 2013 to 2019. So up until the most recent survey. And what you see is the top 3 years where you had the highest number of killings of Black men by the police were 2018, the year after Donald Trump was elected. So that's the first with 1,143. But then the next two are 2013 and 2015, both years under Barack Obama's presidency. Now, fair enough, obviously, Trump hasn't fulfilled 2 terms or have you, as Obama has. But actually, I remember I was a part of the Black Lives Matter movement back in 2016 in the UK, which, to be honest, in that summer, there was 4 deaths in police custody of Black men here in this country, including Edson DaCosta and Rashan Charles. But at that time, what people were talking about was the fact that at that point, with Obama as president, there had been the most murders of black men at the hands of the police than any other president. And so I think what this shows is actually changing the complexion of people at the top, while the same racist system is left intact, doesn't go far enough at all. But having said that, neither can we prioritize as an alternative fighting fire with fire, in the way that the Black Panthers did, for instance. However, the way that the Black Panthers tried, for instance, however courageously they'd fought and struggled. Ultimately, the state actually has access to more firepower. And this is one of the main reasons that the Black Panthers were wiped out. I think history and experience has shown us that racism cannot simply be reformed away, because its use as a means to divide and rule is an essential feature of capitalism. BAME people are the victims of racism and suffer disproportionately, but at the same time are not exclusively affected by police harassment, oppression, or exploitation. And that's why the working class people from all backgrounds have a common interest in uniting to fight those that oppress and exploit us. And I think really the current crisis has shown us who the key workers really are. And if we want to overthrow the system and create a better world, then we must actually harness our collective power to do that. So how can we? I think fighting for unity and so on is absolutely important if we want to strengthen our side and build that collective power that we can see already sort of going from strength to strength in the last couple of days and so on. And I think, building united fronts, for instance, like Stand Up to Racism is really important in that. We want to be able to fight and overcome racism wherever we find it, wherever it appears, whether that's in institutions or on the streets. But more than that, I think we want to get rid of the system. We want to get rid of the system that produces racism and all oppressions, and that's why really we need to talk about revolution. So I think if you agree with that project and aren't a member of the SWP, then we'd like you to join us. But I'll leave it at that and look forward to hearing what people have to say. So.
Yeah, I just wanted to warn. Yeah, what I was saying was thanks everyone for that discussion, because it was incredibly interesting, and especially to hear different experiences from people and so on. I really got quite a lot out of it, and I just wanted to sort of pre-warn that there was a lot in there and stuff, and so I might apologies in advance if I don't get to come back on like absolutely everything, but I think it was good that people were bouncing off one another too, and there were some things that came up more than once, so I'll do my best. But I mean, I suppose to start off with, really starting where I started when I was introducing the meeting, which is really around the question of the statues and so on, because I think for Sean to raise that actually, a lot of the people who are criticising the fact that these statues have been pulled down, whether that's in the media or even people like Keir Starmer, shamefully, saying that that statue should have been pulled down a long time ago, but bringing it down was absolutely wrong. I think particularly when you look at the instance in Bristol, actually people have been petitioning and campaigning for years for that statue to be pulled down and got little to nowhere. People have had enough. They've tried the sort of reasonable bureaucratic routes and have been ignored and dismissed, and people are taking things into their own hands, and I think we absolutely need to be celebrating that. Now obviously a lot of the time, somebody else raised that actually, can't we do more than toppling the statues? And I think there's a lot of contesting of, what's the point of pulling them down at all? And I think, David Olusoga's defense of what's been happening, for instance, in Bristol, in The Guardian, is absolutely right. He's saying that, number one, the pulling down of these statues isn't the erasing of history, but it is history. People actually shifting to the terrain, shifting consciousness, and so on. But then more than that, pulling down these statues isn't about pulling down things that we don't like. It's about opening up bigger discussions about what these statues represent and so on. And to go back to the point around the statue in Bristol, it's not been there since the slave trade. It was actually put up about 180 years ago or something, or perhaps less. It's something a lot more recently erected than people might suspect. And actually it's about putting in a narrative and an assertion of really, old colonial and empire sort of ideas and so on. But I think, what the statues tend to open up in terms of discussion is also, and this is the thing I want to come to, because I think it links a lot to what people are saying around education. But the question around decolonizing education, really, because the question of the statues, like for instance in Oxford University, there's been massive protests outside the statue of Cecil Rhodes, because there's been a consistent campaign to try to take this statue down. It's been ignored by, of course, one of the most elitist universities. And actually, if you watched the rally yesterday, people weren't just talking about their frustrations with a statue of Cecil Rhodes, a white supremacist, and someone who tried to even name an entire country after him in Africa. It was about things like the fact that there aren't very many black black and ethnic minority professors, in particular, like black professors. The courses and degrees and so on were not reflective, for instance, of the things people wanted to study all around the world beyond just Europe and the West, or even things like the attainment gap in universities. People were raising a whole host of issues around racism. So that's what I think these statues mean. Number one, we want to end the celebration of what these things represent. But number two, we want to start asserting what we should be talking about and what we should be seeing reflected in education and so on. But I suppose the other point around education that people are raising was how much we too actually need to educate ourselves and so on. And I think I absolutely agree with that. And to be honest, I wouldn't. That's what I see in the importance of meetings like this, to be honest, or the sort of initiatives people take, for instance, like what people organise around, for instance, Black History Month or what have you. I think things like this, without waiting for, the resources or funding of, academic institutions and so on, people actually taking things into their own house, like creating, finding ways to actually teach and share histories and share cultures and knowledge, I think is quite important and stuff, as well as just fighting for that in institutional education and so on. But I also think actually, I think one of the ways people learn quite a lot as well, and people's ideas advance quite a lot, is also in struggle. I think people learn quite quickly, actually, when there's movements like we see today happening that challenge people's ideas and challenge people's perceptions and so on about the world. So I think as well, if we want to talk about education and so on, it doesn't just happen through sort of reading or trying to study, but actually I think your experiences do too, and being able to discuss them in places like this I think is quite important. But more than that as well, I think it's important to say that when it comes to how we challenge racism or racist ideas, I don't always think actually, when we're confronting people with prejudice or discriminatory ideas, that necessarily we can educate it out of people. Like, for instance, Boris Johnson, I'd say, is absolutely a racist, but I don't think he's a racist because he doesn't know better. This is somebody who has quite a high level of education, one of the most prestigious education you can get in this country. But actually, I think it's because of the utility of those ideas to him and so on. And I think in that way, actually, struggle can be quite key too. Also, to be honest, I think I agree with the point that was made around, the fight against racism isn't just something that should be for Black people who experience racism. Absolutely, they should be at the forefront of it and leading it, because we believe that actually the liberation of people has to be, themselves. You cannot try to liberate people for them. But at the same time, actually, I think really, the racism and oppression is actually used to exploit all of us. So the oppression of some and repression of some in order to exploit all. And so actually, I think what we need to be doing is winning people to understanding that actually racism, they don't have this, racism isn't something that leaves that in a, racism isn't something that's necessarily in their interest. And I think somebody had mentioned the point around the experience of COVID and so on in shaping Black Lives Matter this time around. And I think that's absolutely true, because I think what people notice when they look at the big marches in different cities is, or especially in places like London, but you can see this in the States as well, is how diverse they are. And actually, I think it's because, you know, the experience of this pandemic and so on, I think has, you know, shattered delusions in things like, for instance, you know, well, for one, all of us being in things together. But number two, that actually, you know, that I think it's really reinforced actually the people at the top of society don't actually have any of our interests at heart at all. So when they're criminalizing or profiling or scapegoating some of us, you know, it's not for our protection, but actually to deflect from how much they themselves are to blame for all of our conditions and so on. And so I think, you know, the point around unity is incredibly important. Sorry. My notes are quite scattered because I kept rearranging the order and things because of the discussion. The other point I wanted to come back to be honest, was what JD was raising around like how many of your friends and so on have actually become really politicized and so on. Because actually a lot of the time, you know, when you're talking to people and so on, everyone's got examples of people actually who perhaps have never even thought about, for instance, or like wanted to have big discussions around things like racism and so on. Actually, sometimes even people who haven't been enthusiastic to talk about politics altogether. But you can see a real shift in what's happened now and how much it's excited people and so on. But of course, you know, there are going to be exceptions to that and so on. And I think, you know, of course, you know, there are going to be some people who Black Lives Matter is really riling up. And I think, to be honest, the worst expression of that that I've seen is the people, for instance, who are reacting to, for instance, the Churchill statue being graffitied. Tommy Robinson, for instance, has called a demonstration to try to oppose Black Lives Matter after people had graffitied on the Churchill statue that he was a racist and so on. And really, I think, to be honest, Tommy Robinson can frame it around the question of, oh, well, you know, this is just unnecessary, it's not doing anything, this is an offence or what have you. But I think at the same time, there's also going to be a lot of people who are just very uncomfortable with young, angry Black people taking to the streets and demanding things like justice and so on. I think for a lot of people, that can be something quite intimidating and so on. And so I think these are things that we often have to call out, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is a racist. And so getting people to actually understand what is happening, I think, is quite crucial. I wanted to come back on the point around whether we agree with defunding the police and so on. I mean, absolutely agree with the person who raised the point, and everyone really. We should support the cause in the United States, actually try to get things going here to defund the police, really. I think the person who raised all the points around how much money goes into it in the United States and so on, as opposed to things like education or healthcare, you know, services that are actually quite important to people's lives, I think is absolutely important. But I think more than that, you know, if you look at the police in the United States, not only do they need to be defunded, but actually also demilitarized as well. You know, at the moment, what you're seeing in the US is, you know, actually, you know, police dressed as stormtroopers, using things like flashbang grenades and chemical agents and so on. And actually, a lot of the weaponry and things they use are things that people have been using in the US's intervention in the Middle East as well. So I think, you know, we want to defund the police, but also we want to demilitarize the police as well. And to be honest, as revolutionary socialists, we see, to reiterate what I said earlier, we see the police as really the front line of a state that has a monopoly on the legal use of violence, but really uses this not to protect anyone. And we can see this by how many innocent Black men are killed. You put that with how poor the police are in so many different countries on, for instance, the question of sexual violence or domestic abuse, how poor they can be in responding to those things. I don't think the police are there to protect us, and I don't think it's a thing of bad apples. I think it's the institution itself, and perhaps we don't have time for a discussion around it now, but people can, one of the meetings that the SWP tends to have is what is the role of the police, and can we do without them, which I think is something worth discussing in the current period. Um, yeah, I think on the question around what we do with regards to the police here and what local organisations can do, I think, you know, to go back to what we saw after the murder of George Floyd in the United States, you know, protests erupt in Minneapolis. People even go as far as burning down the precinct where the 4 police officers were burned. And despite all of this, and despite Donald Trump and his administration's triumphantist rhetoric, actually, you know, it's a huge step that actually, in the first place, and one, those officers were fired and sacked, because the amount of, you know, the case of police being held accountable, charged or fired for being responsible for the murders of Black, Hispanic, and different minorities and so on, it is a pretty poor record. So for them to be fired and sacked and also be charged was a big deal. But obviously, of course, third degree is not enough at all. But for this to happen under the Trump administration, I think really it's a sign of weakness on their part, as much as he likes to pretend he's strong and in control in this situation. And I think that can be really a lesson to us. You know, we can see that Black Lives Matter is erupting here in the UK. I think connecting the dots to what's happening locally, what does Black Lives Matter mean in our local areas, is really important. And this is not an abstract thing. I think you saw that in Lewisham last Wednesday for the Day of Action. Lewisham in southeast London, 500 people took the knee outside Lewisham police station. This has started a process to focus on a particular campaign there. Why? Because a Black woman, I think about 2 weeks before George Floyd's murder in Lewisham, was pinned down by 6 police officers while being filmed saying, "I can't breathe," and so on. So people have started a campaign there. Actually, I think is putting a lot of pressure on the police station and so on. I think we can learn things from what's going on in the US, and bringing Black Lives Matter to our localities, I think is incredibly important, to be honest. More than that, you know, of course, you know, when we say Black Lives Matter, you know, one of the chants on the Black Lives Matter march is justice for Belly Majinga. And that's because we understand when we say Black Lives Matter, we're also talking about the Black lives, you know, disproportionately lost to COVID in a way that's incredibly preventable and so on. So I think one of the powers of these local actions where people are taking the knee is the fact that they're safe, considering that, you know, you're 4 times as likely to die and contract COVID if you're Black in this country. So I think, you know, they've been really important things, and hopefully they continue to sort of grow and go strength to strength across the country and connect to local issues. The other point I really wanted to come back to was what Sarah was raising as politically Black and unity and so on, because I think I do, you know, what somebody raised earlier, I know I used the word the term BAME myself when I was talking in the meeting, and to be honest, I can use these things interchangeably, really, so people understand who I'm talking about and so on. But, you know, if we're going to come to a discussion around language, I think people are absolutely right that actually, you know, really, to be honest, as opposed to BAME or BME, I think we should go back to calling people Black, and go back to a definition of politically Black. And it's not an alteration or a change, really. Actually, in this country and elsewhere, what you saw is, particularly before the 80s, and all the struggles against forces like the black shirts in the 30s, or not really the black shirts in the 30s, sorry, in particular with the National Front, in the 80s and so on, you know, their targets were African and Black Caribbean neighborhoods, but they also targeted Asian communities as well. And people built sort of united fronts together, and they were all Black. And I think this was a very powerful thing. And what you've seen since, particularly like since we're supposed to have been in a post-racial society, which is obviously not true. You've seen really the fragmentation of identities and so on, and I think there's a lot of power and utility in going back to that definition of what it is to be Black. And one of the things I want to raise was really, how flexible racism is as an ideology, because, we can struggle against it and win gains and so on, but actually, racism constantly changes to fit the agenda of the ruling classes and so on. And, it was only before lockdown that actually, for instance, Muslim women were seen to be at the forefront of racism constantly being attacked and so on. And really, I think when one racism rises, you see all forms of racism come to the fore again. And I think people were talking about education a lot. There was a teacher who was telling me that when there was, when the management in her school were considering putting through a headscarf ban for young students, and I think they had started to introduce some policy. They also started talking to the Black students about their hair and whether it's non-uniform or not. And in this way, I think you can see that actually, when some practices and so on become acceptable again, actually, the gains we've made in the past can easily be taken or rolled back and so on. So I think really, what people are saying around the fight for unity and so on is incredibly important. And, I suppose to end on the question of what the importance of these protests and so on are. I think what they've really been is, what the comrade was saying around, how inspiring it was to be seeing young people out on the streets of the way that he remembers too and so on. I think is the way a lot of people feel. Obviously not myself, because I'm quite young and part of these protests, and so these are the biggest things I've ever been on. But I know, for a lot of people, and really, I think it's because actually, these protests and uprisings, well, certainly in the States, have been the biggest, not even just from 91 with the Rodney King riots, but actually since 68 as well. And I think what it is that actually, what is happening at the moment has tapped into a wider anger and frustration in society. And I think what it's showing is that young people can really sort of be a detonator for wider revolts and so on. And you're sort of seeing that in the States with transport unions supporting the protesters, saying we're not going to transport arrested protesters or the cops. These people are from our communities where our members are from and so on. We're not doing it. And really, I think we want to see more of this. And I don't see why it can't happen here. It's absolutely brilliant that the best union in defending its workers is also one of the best. Well, in the current pandemic, I think the NEU has been really has done a really brilliant job in the current lockdown in resisting the government and so on. But I think it's absolutely brilliant that they also are incredibly anti-racist as well. In terms of their fighting of Prevent and so on, also have been a part of challenging the DFLA and so on with us in Stand Up to Racism. I think linking what's going on with Black Lives Matter with what the organised workers are doing is really the next stage if we want to actually make sure that this movement and this anger isn't just a moment, but a movement that goes from strength to strength and means that actually things don't go back to what they were like before lockdown. But I'll leave it at that so I don't carry on rambling.